It's my distinct pleasure on behalf of International Week to introduce Dr. Sarah Percy from Oxford University. I think we are really honored and privileged to have her here on campus, particularly in, well, February. Dr. Percy, this is the second talk she's given today. She gave a talk earlier at 3:30 on private security companies and mercenaries from the Middle East to Africa. And like this audience, it was a packed crowd. And I think that's for good reason. She's doing really leading edge work. And I think research and writing on subjects that are inadequately explored. Tonight she's going to be talking about mercenaries, strong norm, weak law. And Dr. Percy is a research associate at Oxford's Leverhulme program on the changing character of war. She is an Alberta woman. She has a BA from Queen's University. She has a MA and PhD from Oxford University. And she also has first-hand experience with lecturing both at Oxford and for the UK military. So I think the depth of her knowledge, but also her expertise and her wide-ranging experience, you will find interesting both during her presentation and in the question period. As I said, her research interests include mercenaries, private military companies, and the privatization of force, the use of norms to regulate warfare, and the relationship between international law and international relations. She is the author of a paper that's out, the Delphi paper, the regulation of the private security industry. She's written pieces called, provocatively called Guns for Hire, among others. And she's currently completing a book, The Norm Against Mercenaries, to be published by Oxford University this year. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Sarah Percy.
Thanks, Melinda, and thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be back in Alberta and to see so many familiar faces in the audience. It's also a real privilege to be reminded of what February in Edmonton is like. I'd kind of forgotten how cold it is. I'm going to be talking tonight about the international law as regards mercenaries, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the problems in this law, why they occur, and why these problems are important. And I'm going to hopefully leave a lot of time for questions and answers. This particular talk I'm giving is based on an article which I have forthcoming in the journal International Organization. And so it is more oriented at an international relations audience. So there will be times when I'll stop and explain some of the international relations or IR terminology I'm using to make sure I don't lose anyone in the audience. And for those of you who are IR international relations specialists, please accept my apologies. I just want to make sure that in this large audience that everybody understands what I'm talking about. So the structure of this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about mercenaries and what they are and differentiating them from some of the other types of private force we see on the international stage. And I'm going to talk about the specific international legal regime designed to deal with mercenaries. And what's especially interesting to me about these laws is that they don't work. They're bad laws. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to then explain to you why the law is bad. And the very short answer is that it's a law which is full of loopholes. It's full of so many loopholes that it's very difficult to actually use. Then I'm going to explain what I think is the reason for why this law is so weak. And that's that there's actually a very, very strong norm against mercenary use. And then I'm going to conclude by talking about why this is so important, why we should study this example of bad law on a very specific subject. In the question period, I'd be really happy. I know some of you were around this afternoon and didn't get a chance to ask your questions, but I can also speak more broadly about private security companies and private military companies and their activities in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not going to focus on that during the body of the talk, but if you'd like to bring it up in the question period, I would be more than happy to take any questions about it. So I'll start off by talking about mercenaries and sort of the broad spectrum of the private military, private security industry which is out there. We really see three manifestations of private force on the international stage today. So we see people who are traditional mercenaries, we see private military companies, and private security companies. In the 1960s and 1970s, what we saw were good old-fashioned mercenaries, and they're the sort of guys you might imagine on the cover of Soldier of Fortune magazine wearing camouflage and with ammunition slung across their shoulders. And they were involved in a lot of wars that were centered around the decolonization process, mainly in Africa. So we saw these guys getting involved in conflicts like the Congo in the 1960s, like Angola in 1976, which was a particularly important piece of mercenary use because a number of mercenaries were captured in Angola in 1976 and they were put on trial and 3 of them were executed. And this created a very large amount of international attention. And then the Seychelles in the late 1970s, early 1980s, which is my personal favorite mercenary story, which involves mercenaries who were hired to conduct a coup. And they weren't very smart mercenaries, and so they arrived in the Seychelles, and they were disguised as a rugby team called the Ancient Order of the Froth Blowers. And they were carrying in their rugby bags, they had their guns. And one of the mercenaries was an especially stupid mercenary, and he went through the something to declare line at customs, whereupon they searched his bag and discovered his gun. And the game was up, and they had a big gun battle in the Seychelles airport and ended up hijacking a plane and flying it back to South Africa. So there are a number of stories like this, and they were very colorful characters. By the 1990s, the industry had taken a real turn. The kinds of mercenaries I was talking about before, they were just not regular, but they were just guys who would be very loosely organized. They would ring up their friends and say, would you like to come have a coup? And they would go off and do it. And by the 1990s, the industry had changed to a very large degree, and we had entities called private military companies. And these were companies like Executive Outcomes that were involved in Sierra Leone and in Angola, and a company called Sandline, which was involved in Sierra Leone and Papua New Guinea. And these guys were completely different. They were very organized companies. They both maintained websites. They had very clear corporate structures. They didn't go off and engage in coups. They said they would only fight for legitimate sovereign states. And by the end of the 1990s, these guys had disappeared and they'd been replaced by another variant of private force, private security companies. And these are the people we see operating today in conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. They provide a very wide range of military-oriented services, which generally stop short of combat or actually fighting. So you see them providing things like bodyguarding for officials in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are between 20 to 60,000 of these people operating in Iraq today, and that's a very, very, very large number, and has had a significant impact on that conflict and how it's played out. So we've seen a very surprising and quite broad evolution in the industry. And I would say there are 3 big differences between these variants of private force. Mercenaries, which I'm going to focus on today, and we still do see mercenaries active. There was a mercenary-led coup in Equatorial Guinea in 2004. The first is that mercenaries would engage in combat, and not only would they actually fight, they would really do it not very selectively. So if you had enough money to pay, chances are you could find a mercenary somewhere out there to fight for you. Private military companies and private also engaged in combat, but they're pickier about their clients. And private security companies don't engage in combat. So these guys are also differ hugely in their level of organization. The traditional mercenary model is really, like I said before, just loosely connected individuals who might phone each other up and arrange things. To the very, very high degree of organization we see, if you want to go home tonight and Google Blackwater, which is one of the big American private security companies, you'll see they have this enormously sophisticated website outlining all of their projects and their employees. And finally, there's a massive difference in the degree of permanence. Mercenaries in the 60s and 70s might go fight in one conflict and then not fight again, or they might go fight alongside a group of different mercenaries in another one. These companies are very, very permanent entities, especially private security companies. They're maintaining a very permanent presence. Private military companies have largely closed their doors. We don't see them, neither Executive Outcomes nor Sandline exists. And there are actually no companies that will openly offer those sorts of combat services operating today. So I'll speculate as to some of the reasons why I think that shift has occurred a little bit later on. So there is an international legal regime dealing with mercenaries, and it was designed in the 1970s. At the time, friends like the people in the Seychelles and Mad Mike Hoare and Bob Denard, who were 2 of the famous 60s and 70s mercenaries, were active. And there are 3 main instruments of international law. The first one is there is an Organization for African Unity, now the African Union. There's a convention that they devised in the 70s. Article 47 of Protocol 1, additional to the Geneva Conventions, is the article that I'm going to focus on today. And the consequences of Article 47 is that it removes prisoner of war status from mercenaries. So if you get caught on the battlefield and you're a mercenary, you're not entitled to be treated as a prisoner of war. And in some cases, that might mean that you could get executed. So